There is a name that has unsettled Israel for many years, a name repeated in briefings and whispered in late-night strategy rooms: Yahya Sinwar. While most people focused on the constant news from Gaza, very few grasped who exactly was hiding in those underground communist tunnels. The man who kept shifting Hamas's plans with a calm, methodical touch. He was not just another high-ranking fighter. He was the planner behind the October 7th attack, the figure who challenged Israeli intelligence in public statements and managed to stay alive despite more than a few attempts to take him out. But on October 16, 2024, the situation finally shifted. The Mossad, supported by the Shin Bet and IDF units, closed in and sealed a long-prepared siege. The result of that single operation reshaped the Israel-Palestine conflict in ways few had expected. Yahya Sinwar was never viewed as a simple target. He was seen as the core mind inside Hamas, the one coordinating moves from the Rafah tunnels, surrounded by layers of guards and relying on hostages as shields. People kept wondering how Israeli forces located him in that dense underground maze and how the Shin Bet and IDF cracked the system built to protect him. Only a small number of specialists could answer those questions, yet here the full picture becomes clearer. The mission that ended Sinwar's life was far from a routine strike. It represented the peak of years of intelligence gathering, undercover work, and long stretches of patience that defined major Mossad efforts. Netanyahu understood that capturing or neutralizing the Hamas chief would not only weaken Hamas, but also disrupt the broader alignment with Hezbollah and Iran. What happened in Khan on that October day in 2024 altered the ongoing shadow conflict between Israel and Palestinian armed groups. To see how events reached that point, it helps to understand who this man actually was, the figure who became for some a symbol of resistance and for others a symbol of violence and fear. Yahya Ibrahim Hassan Sinwar was born in 1962 inside the Khan refugee camp in Gaza, a place where frustration and defiance had been present since the 1948 Nakba. His parents had been expelled from Maidel Ascalon, leaving with almost nothing but memories of the land they had lost and a hope of return that never materialized. Life in a refugee camp is not only about lacking resources. It means growing up surrounded by stories of loss, hearing daily discussions about injustice, and having one's sense of identity shaped by that constant pressure. In this environment, Sinwar was molded both academically and politically. He studied Arabic at the Islamic University of Gaza, but at the same time, he adopted militant Islamist ideas, seeing them as a response to what he viewed as occupation. In 1985, he made his first decisive move.
He helped create Maj, Hamas's internal security branch, a group tasked with identifying and eliminating those suspected of collaborating with Israel. And this moment matters because it marks the point where Sinwar stopped being just another activist and began to gain a reputation inside Hamas, a reputation that would eventually grow into something like mythology for some of its members. In 1989, he was taken into custody and given 4 life terms. The charges covered killings of Israelis and also Palestinians he labeled traitors. This record earned him a grim title, the Butcher of Khan Yunis. Prison did not crush Sinwar. It hardened him and turned him into something far more focused. Over more than 22 years in Israel's highest security blocks, he built skills most inmates never come close to. He picked up fluent Hebrew, pored over Jewish traditions, and learned the rhythms of the society holding him. He studied the people he viewed as his opponents from the inside, with patience and intent. Even behind bars, he kept shaping events. He passed messages, organized loyal groups, and turned parts of the prison environment into a place for political teaching and recruitment. During these long years, his influence inside Hamas grew. By the time he approached the end of his sentence, many already saw him as one of the group's key figures, even though he had not walked free in decades. Sinwar's personality stood out. He carried strict religious discipline, the steadiness of someone trained for conflict, and the habit of thinking several steps ahead. His followers did not only fear him, they admired him. Fighters in Hamas and in the Al-Qassam brigades treated his word with unusual weight. And unlike some senior figures who lived and operated from Doha or Beirut, Sinwar stayed among the people in Gaza and kept close to the underground passages where much of the group's activity happened. He understood that influence came from more than weapons. It came from controlling stories, earning trust, and sharing the burdens that shaped daily life in Gaza. Then, in the year 2011, everything shifted. Israel set in motion a trade it believed necessary, though many inside the intelligence services argued it would backfire. This was the exchange for Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier held by Hamas. One Israeli was traded for 1,270 Palestinian prisoners, and Sinwar was inside that group. The decision, signed off by Netanyahu under heavy public pressure, split the country. Officers warned they were setting loose people who could shape future violence. Those warnings later sounded prophetic. Sinwar walked back into Gaza not as someone broken by prison, but as a figure many saw as unshakable. Surviving those decades and building influence inside a cell had only increased his status. Old networks waited for him, and new ones formed fast. Within a short period, he climbed again through Hamas's internal ranks.
By 2017, he took full leadership of the group's Gaza wing, stepping in for Ismail Haniyeh there. The region at the time was already unstable. Hamas was no longer viewed solely as a local armed movement. It had become one piece of Iran's reach across the Middle East, linked with Hezbollah in Lebanon and allied militias in Iraq and Syria. Sinwar understood the limits of Gaza's resources and also the opportunities created by these alliances. With Iranian financing, weapons streams, and training, Hamas could toughen its position and act in ways that once seemed impossible. In 2021, Israel tried to target him and failed. That miss only strengthened his reputation. His supporters felt he was marked by fate, someone who slipped through death repeatedly. And during these years, he prepared for a major shift in the conflict, something he believed would leave a permanent mark. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched its most violent and coordinated attack to date. Reports counted more than 120 Israelis killed, marking a day that would reshape the region and push the conflict into a new and darker phase. Hundreds of people were taken as hostages, and whole neighborhoods were left in ruins. The world watched as the Al-Qassam brigades rolled out a plan they had been shaping for many years. With Sinwar quietly directing the entire operation, Israel reacted fast and with heavy force. The Gaza war surged to full scale, and Israeli intelligence pushed Sinwar to the very top of its priority list. By August 2024, after Ismail Haniyeh was killed in a targeted strike blamed on the Mossad, Sinwar stepped into full control of Hamas and became, in effect, the most hunted figure anywhere in the Middle East. But tracking down a man who had made the Rafah tunnels his home was like trying to corner a shadow that refused to stand still. After the October 7th attack, Sinwar understood he had crossed a line that put him at the center of Israel's focus. His instincts were right. The Mossad, Shin Bet, and IDF joined together under an internal directive known as Operation Sinwar. They were not driven only by anger. They wanted to break the Hamas leadership structure, cut off its communication network, and warn Iran and Hezbollah that Israeli intelligence could reach anyone, anywhere. The problem was simple to describe and nearly impossible to solve. Sinwar had spent decades mastering the art of vanishing. He knew the maze of tunnels under Gaza down to the smallest corner, and finding him felt like trying to spot a single spark inside a burning haystack. Still, Israel believed its tools and methods gave it a real chance. Surveillance started with constant monitoring of communications. Calls, messages, and the daily routines of anyone close to Sinwar were watched around the clock. Shin Bet pushed agents and informants into Gaza, including former Hamas members who had switched sides for money or safety.
Advanced drones patrolled above Khan Yunis and Rafah day and night, recording heat signatures and marking tunnel entrances buried as deep as 20 meters. These tunnels were not crude shelters. They formed underground networks with power lines, ventilation systems, stockpiles of weapons, and rooms used for command work. Sinwar moved through them like a figure no one could pin down, always protected by fighters from the Al-Qassam brigades and often shielded by Israeli hostages whose presence made any strike far more complicated. The practical obstacles were huge. Israel wanted a clean hit, one that would spare hostages while still stopping Sinwar before he slipped away yet again. He had pulled off narrow escapes before, and each one made the mission harder. A breakthrough came when analysts built a heat map that blended movement patterns, intercepted communications, and witness accounts to predict where Sinwar was most likely to appear next. After weeks of steady tracking, signs pointed to a particular zone in Khan Yunis where Sinwar seemed to be directing activity, maybe preparing a fresh attack or shifting hostages to new hiding places. This pattern created a brief opening, and Netanyahu understood that missing it could mean starting the hunt all over again. Israeli counterterrorism teams were on the edge of launching one of the most dangerous operations they had attempted in many years. Everything depended on timing, precision, and luck. And even with all the planning and technology, no one could say for sure whether the mission would unfold the way they hoped. The central moment came on October 16, 2024, a date that soon became a reference point for intelligence work across the Middle East. After many weeks of steady tracking and quiet cross-checking, the Shin Bet reached a firm conclusion. Sinwar had gone underground, hiding inside a tunnel-linked compound in Khan Yunis, meeting with his closest security circle and maybe even a few relatives. That finding did not rest on one source. It grew out of several channels at once: intercepted communications, persistent aerial monitoring, and a local informant who noticed patterns in the area that did not fit the usual routine. A small reconnaissance drone was sent in without drawing attention. It recorded a man with clear facial wounds, his head partly covered by a traditional keffé, stepping into a structure connected to the tunnel network. Israeli intelligence judged with roughly 80% confidence that the man was Sinwar. For Netanyahu, that level of certainty was enough to move forward. The operation that followed was planned with extreme care. It became a coordinated effort linking the IDF, Mossad, and Shin Bet, using special units on the ground, aircraft overhead, and teams trained to collapse escape paths if needed.
Under darkness, soldiers closed in from several sides, taking up positions around the entire zone, while armed drones stayed above, ready to respond if Sinwar tried to break out. The pressure was intense. Everyone involved understood that even a small slip could cost soldiers' lives or risk the safety of hostages still held elsewhere. When Israeli forces finally entered the compound, a heavy firefight broke out. Fighters from the Al-Qassam brigades resisted with force, but they were overwhelmed in strength and equipment. Later accounts suggested that Sinwar tried to fall back into the tunnels, hoping the narrow space would buy him time. But shrapnel from a grenade struck him before he could disappear fully. What happened next felt almost unreal to those on the scene. Hurt, bleeding, still trying to drag himself deeper into the passage, he was located by an IDF soldier who recognized him by sight. One precise shot ended a long career defined by conflict and defiance. The pattern of the mission was unmistakable: controlled information flow, fast execution, and a level of precision associated with Mossad's most disciplined operations. Within a short span, word spread through intelligence networks. Yahya Sinwar had been neutralized. The question was whether the wider world would accept that immediately, and how Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran would frame their responses to such a loss. The first reactions came with silence. Official confirmation from Hamas did not appear for 2 days, and that pause revealed its own message. The group needed time to verify, to manage internal shock, and to craft a message that could withstand public scrutiny. When the announcement finally appeared on October 18th, the organization portrayed Sinwar as a martyr who defended Gaza to his final breath. Crowds gathered quickly in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Lebanon, where Hezbollah supporters marched with portraits of Sinwar and waved Hamas flags. For many Palestinians and those who support their cause, Sinwar was not seen as a terrorist. He represented long-standing resistance to occupation and someone who chose to fight until the end rather than surrender or escape. On Israel's side, the mood went in the opposite direction. People felt relief, some joy, and a sense that justice had finally landed. In the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, crowds gathered without hesitation. Some set off fireworks. Others just stood still, taking long breaths, finally convinced that the man behind the October 7th massacre would not plan more attacks. Netanyahu gave a nationwide televised speech. He said that the death of Yahya Sinwar did not close the war, but it marked the start of the end for Hamas in Gaza. He added that no militant, no matter how hidden or protected, could slip past Israeli justice. His words carried a loud hint aimed at Iran, Hezbollah, and any other group thinking about striking Israel.
He wanted them to hear that Israeli intelligence works slowly, steadily, and without pause. Reactions abroad split along familiar lines. Western governments, led by the United States and many in the European Union, quietly treated the operation as a strategic win against terrorism. Still, they avoided loud praise so they would not add more fuel to an already unstable region. Several Arab states responded with calls for calm. They stressed that removing a leader does not fix the core dispute, it only keeps the violence repeating itself. Iran spoke without filters. It condemned the strike, called it a cowardly killing, and promised that resistance would rise with even more force. Yet behind all these formal statements sat a simple question: who would replace Sinwar, and how would a new head of Hamas change the course of the Gaza war? Then came the mixed reports. As usual with any Mossad-linked mission, the official story left plenty unsaid. The Sinwar case followed the same pattern. In the days after the confirmation of his death, different versions of the event began to appear. Some voices inside the Israeli Defense Forces said an IDF soldier from an elite team carried out the shot during a raid. According to that account, the unit breached the compound, found Sinwar, and ended the fight in a direct clash. But people tied to intelligence circles told another version. They said Mossad agents were on site, guiding the entire action from the shadows, and maybe even taking part in the killing itself. The confusion was not a mistake. It served as a shield for the methods used and helped keep Israel's opponents unsure about what really happened and how it happened. The disagreement stretched past the question of who squeezed the trigger. It reached the deeper issue of what kind of act this was. International human rights groups raised concerns almost immediately. They asked whether this had been a clean battle or a summary killing carried out outside the rules of war. Several Palestinian witnesses said Sinwar was already hurt and unarmed when he was shot. If true, that would make the act an extrajudicial execution, not a battlefield encounter. Israel, on its side, argued that he had been armed and resisting at the moment of contact, with members of the Al-Qassam brigades positioned around him, framing the whole event as a straightforward combat engagement inside an active war zone. That claim pushed the old argument about targeted killings back into the spotlight. These kinds of operations, which Israel has carried out for many decades as part of its counterterrorism strategy, once again drew global attention and criticism. As usual in the Middle East, the full picture sits somewhere between the loudest versions told by either camp. What can be said with certainty is that the operation did not happen by chance.
It relied on several layers of intelligence, long planning, and the kind of exact execution that people have come to associate with Israeli units. Whether the actors were the Mossad, the IDF, or both working together barely changes the end result. Sinwar ended up dead. But the clashing explanations make something else clear. Control of the narrative has become as central as any firefight on the ground. Each side tries to shape the story because that story feeds the next round of fighters, recruits, and missions. And while newspapers argued over who struck Sinwar and what method was used, the war kept moving forward, shaping outcomes that stretched far beyond the death of one man. The strategic effect of Yahya Sinwar's killing went far deeper than symbolism. It shook the military and political framework of Hamas inside Gaza in a direct way. Removing someone who acted as the brain of the organization meant the rest of the structure could still function for a while, but without steady direction, coordination, or long-term planning. Sinwar was more than a public figure. He acted as the key connector between the Al-Qassam Brigade's armed cells, the financial channels tied to Iran, and the logistical routes that kept Hamas supplied even during Israel's tight siege. His removal left a sudden leadership hole. Regional commanders started making their own calls, often without checking with any higher authority, which weakened Hamas's ability to respond quickly or consistently. Israel took advantage of this confusion and moved to secure firm control over Khan Yunis and Rafah, two areas that had long been strong points for Hamas. Still, it would be a mistake to assume that the death of one leader, no matter how central, can end a movement built on decades of ideology, networks, and outside backing. Hamas is not just a Gaza-based group. It exists across the Palestinian diaspora and draws support from Iran, Qatar, and other actors. Even after Sinwar's killing, scattered Hamas cells kept operating. They fired rockets, staged attacks, and held hostages to maintain leverage. But these actions shifted in tone. They looked less like coordinated strategy and more like scattered reactions driven by pressure rather than direction. Israeli intelligence reported rising internal disputes, with factions arguing about who should step in as the next chief and how the organization should deal with the targeted killing of Sinwar. This internal friction was exactly the sort of outcome Netanyahu had been aiming for, a break in unity that would degrade Hamas's capacity to act as a coherent force. The aim was not so much to wipe out Hamas, but to weaken it enough that it would stop being a serious political or military player. The fallout outside Gaza was just as heavy. Iran, which had long bankrolled Hamas, saw its reach in Gaza shrink fast. Without Sinwar acting as a steady middleman, the flow of weapons and cash became harder to move, and every link in the chain grew riskier.
Hezbollah in Lebanon took note as well. Its leaders adjusted their plans, aware that if Mossad could track Sinwar inside the Gaza tunnels, then no location was safe. Arab governments that had been easing into open relations with Israel viewed the operation as a blunt reminder of Israel's reach. Some quietly stepped up intelligence sharing. Others backed away, worried their own people, many of whom strongly support the Palestinian cause, might push back hard. Yet the main strategic issues still hung in the air. Would Israel's success last, or would it end up as another short pause before the same conflict reignited? And what would Sinwar's story mean in the long run? Yahya Sinwar's legacy cuts in two directions. To many Palestinians, especially those living in Gaza or in camps across the region, he stands for sheer resistance. They see him as someone who never bent, someone who accepted death in battle over any deal that felt like humiliation. His rise from the Kunis refugee camp to the highest ranks of Hamas turned into a story that blends sacrifice, persistence, and defiance. Kids in Gaza and beyond will grow up hearing tales of a man who challenged Israel for decades. Those stories will shape how they see the struggle and will likely push new recruits toward the fight. Movements like this work on memory. Each fallen leader turns into a symbol, and every military loss becomes a sort of moral win that keeps the cycle alive. But from Israel's view, and from much of the West, Sinwar was nothing more than a violent operator. He was blamed for civilian killings, hostage abuse, and for turning Gaza into a network of tunnels filled with weapons. His title, the Butcher of Khan Yunis, came from real acts. He executed Palestinians accused of helping Israel, sometimes by himself. Testimony from former detainees described how the October 7th attack he oversaw led to more than 120 Israeli deaths. Families were erased, celebrations became scenes of panic, and children were caught in the bloodshed. For the people who lost loved ones, there is no space for myth-making. They see a man who used brutality as his only tool. The sharpest debate may be about how he was removed. Israel has relied on targeted killings for many years, and the policy splits opinion even inside the country. Some say these strikes run against international law, stir up new grievances, and raise up fresh martyrs. Others argue they stop attacks and remove key threats before more civilians die. And this tension, like the broader conflict itself, shows no sign of fading. Defenders argue that when arrest or trial is impossible, this approach is the only practical method to remove threats before they grow. Sinwar's killing pushed this global argument back into view and forced many to look again at the hard choices states make in the name of security. How far can a government stretch its authority before it crosses a line?
At what moment does taking out a hostile figure shift from a defensive act to something that resembles murder? No one has clean answers, and every side frames the issue differently. One thing stays clear. The name Yahya Sinwar will echo for many years, repeated with very different tones depending on who remembers him and why. With so many layers now exposed, one last issue lingers. People seek closure, yet closure rarely arrives in conflicts like this. So we circle back to the opening question. Did removing Yahya Sinwar actually redirect the conflict's path, or did it simply become another page in a long, grinding struggle? The honest response sits in the middle. The Mossad strike worked in tactical terms. It showed again that Israeli intelligence can reach any figure in any city, even when surrounded by heavy protection. Netanyahu delivered his message clearly. Anyone who harms Israel will face consequences, even if they hide in the deepest parts of Gaza or Rafah. But the wider war refuses to stop. Hamas has taken hits but has not collapsed. Fresh leaders will step in. Fresh plans will form, and the rhythm of violence between Israel and the Palestinian resistance will continue much as before. Sinwar's death highlights the essence of this fight. It is not only about soldiers or rockets. It is tied to identity, memory, fear, and generations shaped by loss. You can remove 1,000 figures like Sinwar, yet as long as places such as Kunis remain, As long as young people grow up under occupation or under the shadow of terrorist attacks, new fighters will appear. Israel has turned defense into a near-perfect craft through the Mossad, the Shin Bet, and the IDF, developing some of the strongest counter-terror tools in the world. But defense alone does not solve anything. It only keeps the state alive for another day. And survival, no matter how refined, cannot create a stable peace. The deeper message in this story is that victories in the Middle East often plant the roots of the next clash. Operation Sinawar succeeded in its execution, yet its long-term meaning still shifts as events unfold. Iran pays close attention, Hezbollah adjusts its plans, and many young Palestinians look at Sinawar's death and treat it as a call to continue his path. Israel, meanwhile, sharpens its intelligence methods and targeted strike techniques, accepting that this hidden war never pauses. Here lies the core paradox. The more effective Israel becomes at removing its enemies, the more enemies appear, driven by the story of martyrdom that follows each strike. The real question is not whether another figure like Sinawar will rise, but when, where, and what response Mossad will choose when that happens. So after walking through this long chain of intelligence work, covert actions, and quiet battles fought far from public view, the takeaway reaches beyond Sinawar, the Mossad, and the fighting in Gaza.
It shows how power actually functions when the cameras are off and officials speak in careful, measured lines. You've just stepped into a place where high-level intelligence work isn't some distant idea, but something you can picture in detail. You've seen how plans are drawn up, how teams carry them out, and how those moves end up shifting the direction of whole countries. This isn't surface-level curiosity. It's the kind of understanding that changes how you read every headline. And it makes you ask yourself something simple. Do you want to keep taking in shallow updates? Or do you want to actually grasp what drives world events? Once you start seeing how geopolitics, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and the inner structure of the Mossad and Shin Bet fit together, you stop being pushed around by whatever narrative is loudest. You start noticing patterns, spotting motives, and forming thoughts that aren't borrowed from anyone else. And then you look around and realize how rare that is. How many people you know can really explain why the Middle East is as tangled as it is? How many even remember who Sinir was outside the short bursts of attention his name got? How many can walk you through how Iran lines up with Hezbollah, or how the Al-Qassam brigades fit into a wider network that shapes every battle? You can probably count them on one hand. That gap matters. When you dig into these topics with patience and context, you get an edge. It doesn't matter if you study international relations full-time, work inside some corner of geopolitics, or are just someone who wants to stop relying on simplified stories. This kind of depth shifts how you think, how you compare information, and how you judge what's real. And it doesn't stop with you. Knowledge only grows when it gets passed around. So talk about it, share it with people who might need a bigger picture, ask harder questions, go further than you did today. And if you stayed with this all the way to the end, then something here clearly meant something to you. That's the kind of person who fits in this space, the kind who doesn't mind sitting with complicated events, names, and histories until they click. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. More stories like this are coming. You'll see more about covert work, targeted operations, and the inner logic of Israeli intelligence, along with the conflicts shaping what the Middle East will look like in the years ahead. You won't want to miss the breakdowns on Netanyahu, the next steps Hamas might take, or the way the Mossad keeps its position as one of the most feared counterterrorism organizations in the world. Sinir's story may have ended in Kunis, but the quiet war behind the visible one is nowhere near done, and you'll want to be here when the next piece of that story comes to light.